10 hours of work easily, easily. I kind of start out seeing how I can do it literally and what matches up. And there are plenty that something I learned from when I translated Latin as a Latin major was when my brain is tired, just put it aside and come back, which is a good reason not to start the night before on an assignment. And so there are poems that I maybe had 8 lines done, and I just came back to it 4 months later, and my brain had, some things had happened. Yeah, I mean, there's not all of it rhymes sort of perfectly, because part of the thing with rhyming is perfect rhymes often make for really bad poetry. And there are other strategies that sometimes make up. And a couple of the poems, I didn't insist too much on every line rhyming exactly perfectly, because I could do that and then it sounds really cheesy. So there's a there's a play, there's kind of a back and forth with that. I can rhyme fire and desire like any rock lyricist of rock songs. I can go with that. um that's really easy. Fears and tears, there actually are a couple of times where I think tears and fears rhyme in the but don't want to take that too far. I see that Elizabeth has her hand raised. Maybe it's coming down.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that I am working on another book project, and it is a microhistory of free people of color. So
Excellent.
that's in the works.
And actually, Melissa mentioned
And once
something
again,
else
this is
that-
Melissa Daggett. I'm in both Houston and New Orleans. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, no, I'm very familiar with your name and your work. And one thing that you brought up in your question that we didn't get a chance to discuss yesterday that maybe Clint can talk about now, you mentioned the Mechanics Institute massacre, which I'm sure that a number of people listening here today are familiar with, but that not everyone will be. And maybe, Clint, if you want to talk a little bit about that and about the extremely important issues of the newspaper that you were thought lost for such a long time, that you discovered in the course of the research for this book.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, in July of 1866, the previous constitutional convention was reconvened on a technicality with the express purpose of granting suffrage to Black men. And the reason why was that the authorities, the government, quickly realized that former Confederates had taken over. I mean, they didn't realize it, they had, and that the situation was going to go very badly. You have the defeated enemy now taking over all levels of governments. Like the mayor of New Orleans was the mayor when New Orleans seceded. I mean, that's just one example of many. And so that was, simplifying very much. There was an assault on the convention hall, which is currently in the CBD where the Roosevelt Hotel is right now. The Mechanics Institute, designed by James Gallier, it was later a part of Tulane's campus. And around close to 50 people died. Some were convention people. It was just basically an all-out assault. I mean, people shooting into the convention hall, and then later people being gunned down in the streets, mostly Black people, but certainly not only. There were plenty, a number of white allies, including, for example, a dentist named James Dusty, who had addressed in French a meeting of Black Union veterans. And he had this line that I want to weave into some writing. He said, "Go armed, don't attack first, but if anyone goes after you, kill them all." I mean, this was the tone, right? He was telling these Black Union veterans, encouraging them to, to fight back. So there are 3 poems that really touch on this, on this incident. I really have a deep emotional investment in it for the reason that Margaret just mentioned. But I'll just tell everyone, every July 30th, I try to do something on my blog. I've actually published a piece that incorporated a section of the poems in one of the main French language newspapers in Quebec, Le Devoir, back in 2016. Every July 30th, I have this sort of sadness throughout the day, and I expect to see angels flying in the sky, something, church bells ringing, something. And it's very disturbing to me that people in New Orleans, everyone in New Orleans isn't actually sharing the same feeling. I'm sure that some are. And one of the reasons why I have that feeling every July 30th is because I did happen upon, but I deliberately went looking for the papers, the issues of the Tribune that were published in the immediate aftermath. And I'm going to share a little of the backstory. Again, you're going to hear me mention Dana Kress a few times. He's here. He and I traveled. He took me as an undergrad to Worcester, Massachusetts, to a really wonderful repository. It's not quite as big as the Historic New Orleans collection. It doesn't have all the wings of programming and all that that the HNOC does, but it's an important repository for early Americana. And they have a huge Louisiana French collection because of a collector named Edward Laroque Tinker. And Dana Kress was aware of this, and we went and spent a week going through the Tinker collection. And I could go on and on about that week. There were many documents, some of which I've gone back to revisit. But one of them we didn't look at was the folder of the New Orleans Tribune. And so as I realized that, so all of these researchers said, unfortunately, we don't have the Tribune's perspective just afterwards. Or they just didn't mention it. There were some really great books on the New Orleans Massacre, and you just wouldn't see the Tribune cited, or they would say they're lost. And I got to thinking, well, maybe it's sitting in the file they have. Actually, no, I'm sorry. We did open it up. And there's like sort of basically this thin handful of kind of tattered issues. They're in better shape than I remembered them. So I went on their online calendar and realized that they actually had a short run in the week after. And so I have them all scanned, and I'm working on an article where I'm really going to analyze what the content is. I'll end up making it some available. Anybody can go there now. I'd love to do an online exhibit of the content, but so you really get this view of the only newspaper that was really in favor of the convention. And they straight up say, our presses haven't stopped. So in fact, they continued. I think maybe they took a break of one day. And based on the hints from those 3 or 4 issues right afterwards, I've actually found some English language reprints in other newspapers from issues like that are from before what's at the American Antiquarian Society. So there are even some other holes I've been able to fill with that. So I'm still kind of figuring out how it's going to be a scholarly article for one, but it's a view that we don't have. And it's not, they're not shy. They're not, I mean, so one of my favorite quotes from it is from an article, I think called The Wolves and the Sheeps. And I'm going to translate from the French. So he starts out with this sarcastic, the editorialist starts out with this very sarcastic line pointed at Confederates and says, so down with Negroes. So that's what you think. And then looks at them in the editorial and says, sirs, you live in a country of Negroes. Vous vivez dans un pays de nègres. So it's sort of like, think about whose actual home this is, right? And then the next line says, and some of you, actually, I think it says some of you, it may say many of you, have some, and it says batardise, bastardness on that side, recognizing that many of them had cousins of color. And so while they were having this racist behavior, were sort of hiding their own family connections. So the tone is very combative. The tone, it's not at all. And this is after people had seen, their friends gunned down in front of them and known people who died. People were still in the hospitals. The papers have the reports of who's still alive, and there's this straight out combative tone. It says, sirs, you live in a country of Negroes. Basically to say, we will have the right to vote, and we're going to change this place. So I mean, it's stirring, and the poems that are in the book that deal with that are also very, very stirring. So I really hope that whatever committee, that something happens in New Orleans so that every July 30th, people share this feeling. I think there should be a real sense of commemoration and somberness for people who died, who laid down their lives on that day, and others who went to work every single day at the Tribune offices for 8 years, risking their lives. I mean, and I know that that Mr. Houdineh also, I'm sure he carries this, but when you spend a lot of time in those papers, I mean, they showed up at work every day, writing, getting started before the sun came up, walking through the valley of the shadow of death. I mean, that was their walk to work, right? So, I mean, there's so much heroism, and not the battlefield heroism that some of the poems talk about, but just going to work. And some of that involved writing poems. And then why did they need these poems? I think they needed the poems, to keep their eye on the prize, right? To keep their eye on the prize. And I really believe that, the better world we live in, and we do, Angel Adams Parham said it last night. She said, I don't live in the world my grandfather lived in 1930, my great grandparents. We owe it to them. We owe it so much to them. So anyway, I kind of went on a riff there about July 30th, but I think everyone in this room will probably have that sense now. But it's something to carry that. It's something to have visited and spent so much time, like Dana Kress, like Mr. Ludene has, and to know what those people were doing every single day in and day out. And the poetry shows the best of what they wanted to, what their world to be. Anyway, I'd love to have some more questions, but
actually, I'm just going to underscore again the importance of the newspaper. I mean, first of all, this massacre was traditionally called a riot for so long. It was called the Mechanics Institute riot. It was not a riot. It was an attack on a group of peaceful protesters, and having that perspective from this Afro-Creole newspaper is part of changing the public perception of it. And also, I learned in looking at the congressional testimony that there was a congressional investigation after this event. And if you go and look at the records, one of the eyewitnesses talks about watching this unfold and watching someone get shot. And he says, I went to look for the editor of La Tribune.
Yeah.
The first thing he does is he goes and he looks for the editor of this newspaper because he knows that this newspaper will be the one to get the story right. That this one is the one I wanted. This newspaper has to know. This newspaper will tell the story. And just reading that, I think I was reading that testimony after you had discovered that issue of the newspaper, and it was just felt like, oh, yes, it took 150 years, but we found it and we have it. Let's see. Kelly Harris DeBerry, who we were privileged to have yesterday doing her wonderful reading, and are that much more privileged to have today. Yes, claps.
Hi everybody. How are you all doing? It's so good to kind of see Clint, to see you and hear your voice. And yesterday was wonderful as well. I just have a few comments. I was taking some notes as I was sitting here. There were so many great poems in the book. And so the most challenging part was, I think, trying to select a poem out of so many great poems to respond to. And, but I kept coming back to The Triumph of the Oppressed. I just kept coming back to that poem. And I thought, well, maybe I should go another way, maybe this, but I just kept coming back to that poem. And there was just something that stirred me in that poem. It just felt almost kind of divine. And and that this person was anonymous and their name wasn't there. And I just wanted to speak to that, the triumph of the oppressed, and that at some point there was a belief that maybe not the "we shall overcome" kind of byline that we know of, but we were going to overcome this thing. We were going to triumph, whether it be by force or by agreement. So I think that's where I came from with that. But I just want to talk a little bit, just to give some comments back on poetry and public space. I prefer to do things like this more than publishing, because I feel like publishing can sometimes your work can get just hidden on the shelf. But there's something really valuable, I think, in doing projects and like putting poetry in places that people don't expect it to be. And so I think of it as kind of like a jack in the box where, this event or this theme is winding up and pop, a poet comes out. And I think that's just great. I think too often poets are just speaking to other poets. So it was great to kind of get a different audience. A couple of people texted me and called me and things of that nature yesterday. And to someone's point about Poetry Month, there are cities that are doing poet laureates. New Orleans doesn't have one. We do have a state poet laureate, but we don't have a city one. And so, but I would love to see poets kind of doing a poem before city council
Oh,
or
yes.
doing different things of that nature to really engage the poet with the community. I consider myself more of a people's poet, if you will. And so I want to see more of that happen. And unfortunately, the literary arts is the least funded of all the kind of arts. You don't really see a lot of poems on murals and things of that nature. And then I want to just talk a little bit about the orality. Like a lot of Black poets had to lean on the orality and performance part because a lot of times poets can't be published in journals, or African American poets, their style doesn't lend to maybe the journal or things of that nature, or just because of the nature of racism inside of publishing. So, you know, a lot of African American poets found their way to publish kind of live, if you will, by relying on the orality of poetics. And so I think there's something in that when you look back over time at poetry, in particular, folks of color. And I think that was all of my kind of notes, but it was a pleasure to do it. And I'm so glad that people enjoyed it. And yeah, so I just wanted to just offer my 2 cents in it. And I feel like now doing this, maybe some 100-something years later, maybe there'll be another poet responding to my poem. That's all that I can hope for. So thank you all.
Well, I think you're going to get some more text messages once the once the video gets out for sure. Yeah. So
you know what, Clint, I'm going to let you finish, but I just want to jump in since and let people know that we will be publishing Kelly's video on our website probably toward the middle of the month. We do actually intend to take advantage of April as being Poetry Month too. Kelly's video will be there, as well as a response to a different poem by Mona Lisa Saloy, and a third poem, Kalamu Ya Salam, which he wrote as a dialogue and he reads together with his daughter, which is very, very moving and wonderful. And a little note that I will say, something that when we started this project, we had no idea that would happen. All of the poets were invited to choose any poem they wanted from the book, any poet at all. And all 3 of them, without consulting each other, without talking with us, chose poems by anonymous authors.
wow.
Now, there are about 80 poems in this book, and we know the authors for 90% of them. Like we know, we have the authors for at least 70. I think it's really only 10 of them that are either anonymous or a pseudonym. And they all of their own accord chose poems by people who did not feel that they had the power to affix their name to their opinion, that what they were saying was too dangerous for them and that they were somehow not allowed. And to have these contemporary 21st century poets be able to put their names to their own responses was something that we didn't even, once again, we feel like the media, we do feel like it's a seance, like it's a conversation between that poem and these poems, and that we're just the telephone wire or something happening. And that was a real privilege for us too. So we're very, very excited to be able to put Kelly's poem up there and the other 2. And we hope everyone will watch this space, come back to the book's website, and we'll be able to publicize that when that's up there. But okay, just a little administrative interjection. Clint, please.
Kelly, so one of the things, this is for everybody really, but what you were saying about the orality, I wanted to quickly respond to that about the 19th century context of the New Orleans literary scene. And you may have done your own research and may know, and others probably don't, but I wouldn't let the formal qualities of this poetry, so the fact that it is, respecting the rules of its time, give anyone the idea that it wasn't being read aloud, because it was. I mean, there was the context of social circles, gatherings in private homes, Economy Hall. I'm sure that they read poetry there. I haven't gotten Fatima Sheikh's book yet. And we know this is documented. And if you want some very specific references, I can tell you where to find them. We have poems that were published later that of which it is said, this was in family notebooks, this used to be read, but there was no place to publish it. And they are some daring poems that were written by free people of color. So we know that, I mean, this was just a common thing. And part of it was literary salon culture, so people having people in their homes and reading. And that was not necessarily by, racial identity. That was just common, for one. And then the fact that, indeed, the outlets for publishing, one, for people of color, there were writers of color who published in mainstream New Orleans newspapers, but they had to really be careful about their approach. And so I've been very interested in some of those writings, but so I think you should take maybe some pride in knowing that these poems were read out loud. And I have no doubt that many of them were probably tested with friends, so I've got a new piece I want to share. I mean, much like you may or may not do, I'm certain that was the case. Adolphe Duhart, the main poem, he has one that's dedicated to the Francs Amis, one of these benevolent societies. He may very well have read it at a meeting and then sent it in, so I think there's a real genealogy there. So.
Yeah, and I should have had more clarity in that. I wasn't suggesting that they weren't. Sure. But there's also in that tradition of the transatlantic slave trade coming over. A lot of the orality had to be carried over. Sure. And to your point about genealogy, I just found out, I just reconnected with some old family members, and I found out that my great grandmother wanted to be a poet, and they have found some of her original poems that she didn't feel she could go out and do poetry because she was supposed to be a domestic and all of that. So yes, it comes back somehow, some way, some plant and others water. And so yeah, I felt all of that energy inside of kind of reading. But for sure, I'm sure that they were discussing things amongst themselves and trying to see if that sounded right and that kind of thing. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Well, thanks for sharing that about I believe you said your grandmother.
My great-grandmother. Mm-hmm.
Great-grandmother, because I'm fairly convinced, all of the known poems in this volume are men. We don't know about the anonymous ones. I'm fairly convinced that there are some treasure trove of women's poetry in French lying somewhere in somebody's attic, in somebody's trunk, waiting to be discovered. I'm fairly convinced. We just need to, it just needs to be unearthed.
Well, apparently she spoke French, which we're like, what? So she was in Alabama. So I'm trying to find researchers that can help me unearth her story as well. So thank you.
Mark Rudane.
Hello.
Please, we are so glad to have you here and to have you be able to speak. Mark Rudane, for those who do not know, is actually heir apparent to La Tribune, and perhaps knows as much, if not more, about it than anybody here about that newspaper. Please.
Well, I'm so pleased to be part of this discussion. And I have to say, as a person who has read every single issue in French and English multiple times, I'm just deeply, deeply appreciative of the depth of research that Clint Bruce has brought to this project. It's truly a remarkable work. I consider it a masterwork. I would also add, I have a long and deep friendship with Dr. Parham, and she also shares that understanding. And it was so pleasant in yesterday's session to see the conversation between Dr. Parham and Clint Bruce. So it was just wonderful. Speaking to the issue of orality, I was just moved to tears by the video of Kelly Harris DeBerry, her poem Response to Triumph of the Oppressed. And just as an aside, the gentleman who is reading the poem, Ivan Griffin, is a member of Afro-Creole in New Orleans,
right,
which is dedicated to the recovery of lost works of 19th century composers of color, many of whom we can read about in La Tribune. So just to see that back and forth, and I just hope there's more of it. I must confess, when I read the Tribune and the poems, and I've translated a few myself, I have to read it out loud. And there's an orality to many aspects of the paper. There are hundreds of powerful editorials, Black voices captured, which have never been exposed to the public. And when I read them, I'm moved to tears, just by their sincerity, by their passion, on so many different levels. But more than anything else, and I've actually copied almost all of these editorials. More than anything else, you need to read these out loud. The editorials need to be read out loud because they read like speeches and they're so passionate. So as we uncover this suppressed history, I think it's really important to center the voice, not just the voice, on the paper, but the voice that we can actually hear with our ears, to make that manifest. And just to go back on one other point with monuments and markers, it is possible, and I'm sure there will be a marker from the Mechanics Institute. I'm sure I'll be part of that. But it is also possible, as you travel the city with your phone, to actually stop at sites and listen. Now, we have the Sites of the Slave Trade as a phone app, and you can stand in front of the St. Louis Hotel and you can listen to a beautiful oral history of what happened there. And that kind of thing I also have developed a tour of New Orleans history.
Yes, it's a great site.
New Orleans history. It's a phone app-based thing. And without going on and on and on, I think it's very important to amplify in audio the words that are captured in print. So again, just thank you so much. It's just been an incredible experience to be part of this weekend, and in particular, your session, Clint. Thank you so much.
Well, I think a lot of us, maybe who haven't had the chance to write a book like I have, but have really gotten a lot from your work in promoting the Whodini legacy and the Tribune legacy. And I really take to heart, there's a copy of that at the HNOC, and there's a version online, I think, the text version on whodini.com. What you said about the voice, and especially the editorials, I mean, it makes me want to go home and pull up one of my PDFs and do a little reading out loud of the editorial. Some of the poems, it did help me to read them out loud, just to kind of test them out. But I could see some really wonderful activities, around selections from the editorials. Some of them are very specific about some very specific, labor contract issue, and some of them are universal in their reach, right? So there's a lot of that would be fantastic.
I will say too that just the way that oral performance came up throughout the research, every time I was following something through, the name Louise Dumortis comes up, and
Yes.
she was a famous. She was Northern, but she was a very, very popular and well-respected orator. And at one point, one of the poets invokes her voice in one of his poems, although sort of oddly, he calls it gentle and feminine, where apparently she was very well known for having a very sort of
Booming.
resonant voice. So it's sort of, we had a discussion of like, okay, what is he doing there exactly? We're not sure. And other times, well, what was this play? What was the name of this play? Well, it was called this. And oh, look, we find in La Tribune that there was a benefit performance of this play that was being read in order to raise money for, I don't know if it was for the Couvent School or another institution for orphans, but just the orality and the so much about the network of this community and all of the circles that it permeated, it just bubbled up comes up through even the marginal notes in this book. I mean, if you could pick up this book and just go through the poems and just read the margin notes and have a wonderful picture of the way that these communities of writers and of activists and the people writing the editorials and actors and performers were all, and entrepreneurs, business people were all in conversation together and working so hard to improve circumstances for all of these people. I thought I saw Bob or Lynn. There's Lynn Frank and Bob Hammer. Did you have a question? I saw a hand go up at some point. No, maybe we've got time for one more. Lynn.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of the things that you have said. I have learned so much. This is kind of an esoteric question, but did you go back and study French poetics of Lamartine, Alfred de Musset, or Victor Hugo as you were working on your translations to compare the French of our Louisiana authors with the French authors in Paris?
That's a great question. And so that is actually, I've been studying French poetics. Okay, so I'm 41, so for well over 20 years. Even as a high school student, that was part of the curriculum at Caddo Magnet High in Shreveport. And then, of course, studying under Dana Kress at Centenary College, who's a trained 19th century scholar, we did a lot of that. So that was actually already built into the way that I read a French poem, is immediately, interested in how the Alexandrian, the line of French poems. So in English, we have the iambic pentameter. That's been our default. It's the Alexandrian in French. And so yeah, absolutely, Lynn. And I would say that generally, whenever it's an Alexandrian, I generally tried to see, well, can I make this work in iambic pentameter? There are a few times where I found that the English, I needed a little more room, so I turned it into hexameter, which gives it more weight, right? It has this almost epic feel. But the answer to your question is yes. I mean, the actual work that they were doing with rhythm, meter, sound correspondences was absolutely fundamental. And I'm just going to brag a little bit. Like I could go through any poem, any translation I've done, and I could show you all sorts of different sound effects I worked to create, whether they're patterns of repetition, whether they're rhythmic effects. Sometimes they mirror what's going on in the French. Sometimes they're new patterns I've tried to create. Even in that little stanza I read from Ignorance the other time, there's an effect in one of the French lines that I put in two of the English lines, so it actually doubles up on the English side. So, I wouldn't sort of go off and give a whole lecture on, I'd be happy to do a lecture on translation strategies for what I did, but yes, the answer is yes. So what they were doing with their French poetics, they mastered their craft. I mean, they really mastered their craft. And that was, and what Margaret just said, they weren't doing it as professional writers. They were doing it as business people. They were doing it as teachers. So in that sense, they were teaching, many of them were teaching languages. But some of them were, Henri Louis Rey worked at a hardware store. For much of his life. Adolphe Duard, he worked as a mason when he was younger, taught for many years, and then worked as a printer towards the end of his life. Poetics and poetry were part of their intellectual, just what they learned, right? That was a big part of it. So tell them
about the challenge of the Bobby Burns poem, the Robert Burns poem.
So one of my favorite, we had a little back and forth about this. So there's a poem written by, we believe, a future Secretary of State, Émile Honoré, who came from a planter family in Pointe-Coupée Parish, so free people of color who were planters themselves. And he has a poem that is a pastiche in French of Robert Burns' well-known classic, A Man's a Man for All That, or is something for Honest Poverty. And it's a poem about equality. That's what it's about. And it's written in Scots. So it's in the French is written in this kind of oral vernacular style, but it's not Louisiana Creole. It's not actually any French dialect. It's just meant to read as not high class. And so I was like, oh God, what do I do with this? So I went and read a lot of Robert Burns, whom I like. Actually, around that time, I actually went to a Robbie Burns supper in Annapolis, Nova Scotia, where they read Robert Burns while I was working on it. I'd never been to one of those.
Do some.
Yeah, I'm not gonna imitate any. So I back translated it into Scots. So I'm sure someone in Scotland might look at it and go, oh my God, why did he pick this word? But I spent a lot of time in Scots resources like glossaries from 18th century, and there's a Robbie Burns website. And Margaret and I had some back and forth where she said, okay, this is like over the top. And I sent her back samples of Burns. And because Burns, some of it's English that's slightly Scotch tinged, and some of it's really written in his native Lowland Scots dialect. And I sent her back Is There for Honest Poverty and said, he's actually going pretty heavy on the Scots here. And Émile Honoré, you know, a Black French speaker growing up in Pointe-Coupée Parish, was reading Robert Burns. I mean, it's very clear, you know. So, you know, this is their cultural world. I had a lot of fun with that one.
Yeah. That was another place. That was another thing that he was right about, and he made the case. And as we talked about a lot, there is no one translation is not a matter of accuracy or about faithfulness. It's a matter of equivalence and what you prioritize for the reader's experience. And Clint was very persuasive that Honoré wanted the reader to have this experience of reading this vernacular, and that any straight up translation was simply not going to be doing what the poet wanted it to do. And,
Something I might
yeah. Go ahead.
I'd like to maybe in part address to Kelly and maybe any other poets out there. Margaret's very right. And, you know, any one translation is only one possible. It's like that theory of like multiple universes, you know, multiple, you know, worlds. I would love to see other people doing other translations of these poems. I mean, maybe they could sort of read mine to get a sense and then do something totally like slam style, but it's actually a translation, right? So I don't at all think because I chose this approach for this book, I would love to see other people, you know, really making these breathe. So you know, with the challenge that you and the other poets, you know, was to create an original work inspired by, you know, by one of these texts. And I have no doubt that the others will have risen to that, you know, as you have. But I'd love people to do other types of translations, you know, more modernist style, do jazz poetry, kind of Langston Hughes. I would love that. So it's not because I've worked on this that I feel any sense of proprietorship or whatsoever. Like, you know, it's let it do the work it needs to do.
Okay, well, I'm going to, unfortunately, we are out of time. We're actually a little bit over. We're going to have to close out the meeting, but thank you so much, Clint, and thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for every single attendee. It's been really wonderful, and this was really great. So please
Thank you, Margaret.
Stay in touch. Come back to our website, look for Kelly's video, look for the more poetry, look for more things we'll be doing with Clint and Clint's book, and enjoy. Have a good Sunday evening.
Thank you all.
Bye.